Frequently asked questions about managing a planning office. One of the first questions you'll get, particularly in some government agencies, is what to do about nepotism. What do you do when the mayor suddenly decides their nephew needs a job in the planning office? How do you work with that situation? Unfortunately, it does happen, and you have to deal with it. There are some tips to dealing with this situation. Try to find a place where that employee can do something helpful. Be open to the fact that he or she may have useful skills and may genuinely be interested in what you're doing. If they're not interested in what you're doing, there may be certain things they can do within your organization to be helpful regardless. The fact is, most people do not want to sit around all day doing nothing or sitting on their phones while everyone else is working around them. This is where making sure that there's a sense of camaraderie in an office can be helpful, because most people want to be part of a fun team. On the other hand, it's very important not to let them get away with not doing anything. This can be a very sensitive situation if they're connected to somebody who has some power over you, but you do need to make sure that employees in your office are being part of your team. You'll have to handle that on a case-by-case basis. Another question that you hear a lot is, this all sounds good, but you must be thinking about a planning office with 100 employees. I have 3 people, we work all day on doing our development review. We don't have time to do anything else, and I certainly don't have time to do any managing. I'm too busy doing the work myself. Very sympathetic to that. However, I do think that it's important to try to take a step back and realize that every organization can do certain things to improve. You need to make sure you right-size your work plan to your assets and resources. Part of that may involve having a solid work plan and making sure it's tied into your budget. You don't want to overpromise, particularly to political leaders. They won't necessarily remember that you don't have the resources to do those things. On the other hand, they'll often respect the fact that you say, that's an interesting project, but I simply don't have the bandwidth to do that this year. On the other hand, don't be negative or critical all the time. No one wants to hear from somebody that we can't do that because we're too busy. We can't do that because we're too busy. You need to try to provide choices. If you want us to do this, here's what you'll need to do to make it possible. It may involve more resources, or it may involve deprioritizing some other project that your office is working on. None of this is to downplay the fact that some offices have far too few people and far too many things to do. On the other hand, as a manager, it's important that you think about things in a step back and not always get wrapped up in the day-to-day work. Another question has to do with the fact that this may all sound simple, but have you ever heard of the union contract? Have you ever had to deal with the fact that somebody has filed a grievance and won even though they had no basis for that? The fact is, most of these contracts do still require that people get up, go to work, and do their work. They also generally require that people do their work well. If you read the contract carefully and you're consistent about how you apply it, you usually find that most unions will be sympathetic. They don't want an individual worker to make their organization look bad either. On the other hand, they will be very protective of their union members, and they will want to make sure that you take the steps you need to do. As I said before, it's really critical to read these contracts carefully and think about what steps are needed if you need to do something to follow up on performance. Also, don't just generally allow people to do things that are understood has always been allowed. There are common practices that may not be in the contract that people have done for years and years and years. That does not mean they get to continue to do it if you decide that's no longer part of your practice as an organization. For example, it may be that people have always been able to get paid overtime when they work extra hours, but the contract offers a choice of you giving comp time instead. That may be a management decision that you can make, and there really is usually not a recourse they can have if both options are listed in the contract and you're clear as to which one you're going to follow. Another frequently asked question from managers is, I'm just not good with people. I just don't really like dealing with them, and I don't know what to do if I need to tell them what to do. This is a tough one, but most people can learn how to work in a management role with some practice. You should lead by example. You don't feel you need to make small talk all the time. If you're not the type of person that feels comfortable walking around the office all day, checking in with people, that's fine. Find your own skill set, find your own way of doing so, and follow it. Again, you need to do some internal thinking about what your ways of dealing with things are, and then utilize those. Don't just follow someone else's example. Another important part of dealing with this issue is to practice public speaking. You may need to watch yourself on tape at a board meeting to see what you can do to improve. You may need to think about what you're good and bad at. At the end of the day, if you're going to be in a management role, you're going to have to deal with some of these issues and you're going to have to figure out how to improve. The last frequently asked question, again, this all sounds good, but my office just goes from crisis to crisis and there's never any rhyme or reason to it. You just don't understand how crazy it is here. Believe me, I understand how crazy it is there. I've been there as well. It's tough to take the step back. Sometimes you have to do it when you have extra time on a weekend or at night, but it's important to think big picture if you're going to manage an office. Sometimes you go from crisis to crisis because ground rules haven't been set. Sometimes you don't have good systems in place, and as a result, everything is a crisis. Everyone is busy, and everyone is afraid to say no to political leaders. It's important to think about how you can set some parameters to manage your office well and try to stick to them. And remember, at the end of the day, this is not an all or nothing proposition. It's not mandatory that you do everything in this training session in order to be a good manager. These are tips, and you'll obviously have to apply them in your own organization. I hope you've enjoyed thinking about planning management with me for a little while. It's always helpful to think through these things and what you can do to help your organization be more effective. As I've said a few times here, you're going to have to think personally about what your organization, your office, and your situation is like. But if you apply these tools, I think you'll be able to get a little bit more effectiveness out of your office and hopefully do a better job for the community you serve.